How's it going, everybody? And welcome to episode 252 of Master My Garden podcast. Now, this week's episode is another listener's question. So, last week's one, actually, a good few people messaged to say that the episode had helped them in their quest to choosing the perfect greenhouse. And yeah, it's nice to see those messages after the episode. It's one we had covered before, but I suppose, yeah, people think about greenhouses at this time of the year, so it's a good time. This week's one is something similar in that we've covered it or kind of covered it in the past. And we would have covered elements of it certainly before. So, but nonetheless, it's good. It's topical, and yeah, another listener's question this week. It's a strange kind of a week. We've had some really heavy frost for the first time, which I know has kicked off a lot of the lifting of bare roots and root balls. They were sort of happening anyway, but root ball and bare root now is in full flow. And after a few nights frost, but yet still, there's still these very strange mild temperatures. It's a funny kind of a November. Has been dry relatively, and relatively or very mild, I guess, for the time of the year. And I know a lot of people are seeing, things still flowering that really, shouldn't be flowering and so on. And it's causing a few eyebrows to be raised. But nonetheless, it's going to shorten the winter, we hope. And, the further we go, the closer we are to next spring again and looking ahead. So it's good to see some nice weather, and it certainly has helped, with things like bulbs, and it's definitely going to help now as well for bare root season as well. As I say, that's really kicking off now. All the fruit suppliers, you get all your fruit at this time of the year, all your trees, your hedging, all of that sort of stuff is in full flow. So if you have any mind to do any of that type of work, now is the time to be at it. But to get back to this week's question, the question comes in, hi John, in my garden, I have a lot of leaves. Want to figure out the best way to use them. I know obviously I can create leaf mold, but how do I go about doing that, or how else could I use them? So it's a good question. It is one that we've sort of covered in parts before, but it's definitely something that's really, really topical. At the moment, everywhere you look, there's fallen leaves gathered on the ground, and most trees here in Ireland have dropped their leaves at this stage, with the odd exception. I see a couple of, native oak trees here holding the leaves very, very strong and actually still quite green, funnily enough. It is one of the later ones to drop anyway, but it seems to be like really, really green and not very autumny looking yet. I know that's not the case everywhere, but a few here are like that. But certainly most other leaves have dropped off, and a couple of kind of storms a couple of weeks ago really sped up that process and knocked a lot of them. So leaf mold, as many of you know, is a hugely beneficial resource in any garden. And the more of it that you can create, the better. And this listener obviously has quite a lot of them, and they know that, there's a benefit in it, and they want to know what's the best way of sort of processing it. And I suppose the question always comes up, how do you go about creating leaf mold? And it's a very, very simple process, but it's a quite slow process, and that's the key with it. So I'm going to talk about leaf mold, and then we're going to sort of delve into other composting methods as well. And composting is kind of slowing down at this time of the year. The material that you have is reducing quite a lot, but it's also a good time to sort of look at your setup and maybe consider for next year. So leaf mold, anyway, for a start, is hugely beneficial. And when it's fully ready, it's an absolute gift it's gold for a garden. So it has a lot of microbial presence in it, or microbes in it, and they will really improve the soil health wherever you mulch over. The thing with them is that they need time, and the way to do it, I suppose, depends on the scale. So there's a few things you can do. So if it's in a large scale, if it's in a large area, and you want to use them directly in your flower beds, you can. But what you really need to do in a scenario like that is you need to mimic what would be happening in a forest. And what would be happening in a forest is you would get a light sprinkling. So under a given tree, or under a canopy of trees, you get a light sprinkling basically everywhere. So That light sprinkling falls to the ground, sits there really, really slowly over time, breaks down, and eventually becomes the soil. And you end up with a really fungal rich, really healthy soil from that. But the key to that is the small, thin layering of it. So if you can envisage that in terms of your flower beds, there's a few things you can do. So number one, you can take these leaves directly and mulch them directly onto your beds, even into your pots, but on a really, really thin layer. And the thing about it at this point in time is that some of them might be still quite light and crispy and dry, and they can get blown around. But if they're already a little bit damp, if you put a light layer all over your beds, and when I say a light layer, like I'm talking a few centimeters, they will decompose over the next sort of 8 to 10 months, 12 months, and they will feed your soil in a great way. But the key there is not to add a huge amount. So it's a really, really thin layer, mimicking what you would see in a forest or on a forest floor. If, on the other hand, you have a huge amount of them, then it's a great idea to take advantage of them. So if they're gathering on your driveway or in your yard or whatever the case may be, then gather them up, and then we need to put them somewhere where we can basically create leaf mold separately. Now you can compost, but again, a little bit like add them to your flower beds, you can add them to your compost heap or your compost bin, but it has to be in really, really small amounts. You can't just load them all in, or it will slow down the compost bin. So again, small and often. If they fall on your lawn, the recommendation is to rake them off. I personally don't really mind them being on the lawn. What I typically do is I'll set them more high, mow the grass, gather up those leaves, and actually add that to the compost heap. So small amounts of leaves chopped up with the bit of grass, and I'll add them to the compost heap. But I don't mind them being there. They're perfectly fine. They'll break down there anyway. But if they're on the driveway, for example, I will gather those up. And to create leaf mold, what you need to do is create a cage. So you have to have airflow. You need to lump them all together. You need to keep them contained because, as I said, it can blow around. So ideally, what you're looking at is some chicken wire created into, if you cut it and create a circle that might have a diameter of 1 meter or 1.5 meters, something like that, and you tie it off where you join the wires together. So you create this circle or a cylinder with your chicken wire, and then you load in your leaves and you stack them up and you compact them, and then just leave it, forget about it. And over time, that will completely break down. The cylinder that's full now with leaves will break down so much that when you get back there next year, you might have maybe a foot or 30 centimeters, 45 centimeters of leaf mold in the bottom. But the key to it is time. So you're talking about leaving this for the guts of 12 months. And if you leave it 12 months, you'll have a really, really superb additive for mulching and so on. That's on a bigger scale. If you're on a smaller scale and you want to just create a little bit, you can get it as simply as getting plastic bags like a bin liner, gathering up all these leaves, stuffing them as much as you can into that bag, and then tying off the top of the bag. You puncture holes in it, with a pen or your pencil or your finger or whatever the case may be. Just puncture some holes into it, and then leave it somewhere like at the back of a shed where it can't be seen. And again, you're leaving it for that long period of time. And then you take out that bag, you heal out, again, 12 months-ish. You'll heal out that, and again, you'll have really, really high quality leaf mold. And this leaf mold can be used, obviously, for mulching. But if you don't have a huge amount of it, it can be just spread in a really thin layer, and that will improve the soil life in the various beds where you add it. So it's a really superb thing that you can generate. I know a lot of, say, bigger gardens, they will gather up all the leaves and create, essentially a compost heap, which is all leaves, and they will leave it for a long, long period of time. And then at the end, they'll mix it with either good quality compost or farmyard manure, or something along those lines. And that mixed together will be an absolutely phenomenally good fertilizer, mulch, and yeah, something superb in your garden. So that's very, very simply how you create leaf mold and the benefit of it. But you can use it if you have small amounts, as I say, directly on the beds, but just don't put a huge layer there. Can you add it to your compost bins? Again, yes, you can, but just again in small layers. And that's, that's essentially it. It's nothing else, only time. So it needs that 12 months because they do break down slowly. But when you give it that time, then it's it's a really, really good and beneficial additive to your garden. So that's leaf mold. Really, really simply, quite quick. I hope that answers the question. Depends on the scale that you're at, but it's either plastic bags or a big cage that's created and use it in that way. And the the lead on from that, then I suppose I'm going to look at composting. And again, composting is something we've covered before, and leaf mold would have been something that I covered before. And I had Kate Flood, the compost coach, on, and that was a really good episode on the various forms of composting and I suppose the methods and so on. And so I'll talk about some of those again. And all of them have their place, and you don't need them all in your garden, but they all have a use and they're all really beneficial. But you just find the one that suits you best. If you have a lot of leaves falling, then creating leaf mold makes absolute sense. And then out from that, you're looking at the various methods of composting. So to look at them, then you're talking about the compost bin. These are, the plastic type Darlac bins, as they call them. They're just a plastic cone shape with an open bottom, little hatch on the bottom for taking out compost. You actually would probably rarely use that hatch on the bottom, and then a twisty off lid on the top that you take off while you're filling in the materials. And people will often ask, how do I use the compost out of one of these? And I suppose it all depends on, again, the amount of material that you're actually creating. So if you're in a very, very small garden, one of these bins is going to be perfectly fine. And what you're going to do basically is you're going to locate your bin somewhere, and the only key with it is to put it somewhere where it's not going to be waterlogged. So on the soil, but in a kind of a dry area. And what you're looking to do essentially is you're looking to fill that bin as you go with a mix of kind of 50-50 green and brown materials. And we'll go through those in a moment. And you keep filling that bin for a certain period of time, and it will start to compost, from the bottom. It'll be that because that's the first material in. The heat will build up in there. It will start to break down. And this is where people, start to get confused when they only have one. As I say, in an ideal world, what you'll have two. And the way you'll do it is you'll have one filled, then you'll start your second one, and you'll start it by lifting off the bin off and leaving like a column of all that material there. The fresher material, which will be on the top of the heap, you put that into the bottom of your second bin, and you keep going down until you get to a really fine composted material. And that's your almost mature compost. At that stage, then you can start filling your second bin. You can put your plastic bin back over the little bit of what looks like compost that you have, and you can leave that to mature a little longer if you want. Or at that point, if you think you've left it long enough and it is fully matured, which takes, depending on the time of year, minimum of 6 to 9 months, but 12 months again is the ideal sort of number. If it's matured to that length of time, then you can use it directly onto your beds. If not, you put your first bin back over that, and you allow that to mature fully for another couple of months in there while filling your second bin. If you only have one bin, then the process is you take off the lift off the bin when it's full. Again, your column is formed within there. You locate your bin right beside it. You scoop off the fresher stuff on top and keep going downwards until you get to what looks like compost. Then you close up the bin, with the material that you've just taken off the top of the first heap. And what you're left with is hopefully compost that's ready to use on the garden. And so that's how you do it with one bin. You rarely scoop out from the bottom of out through that hatch door, as I say, because it's not, what ends up happening is it's hard to get it out. You're also, at some point, you're going to be taking out some compost that's not fully right. You're going to be kind of taking it out through compost that is mature, some that's not mature, and it kind of gets mixed up funny. But by lifting off and restarting beside it, you kind of are able to layer it yourself and get it right. So that's your standard compost bin. Compost heap, then, if you're on a bigger scale, is essentially the same thing. It's enclosed. Generally speaking, it's timber, or you can use pallets, and it's completely closed on three sides. And then you put some sort of a removable front on that, and that's your compost heap. They're typically, 1.5 meters by 1.5 meters, thereabouts per bay. Again, can be a lot bigger depending on the size of the garden or the amount of material that you're producing. But that's typically what you're looking for. And again, you're looking for, going in there, sort of a 50-50 mix of green and brown. And as I say, we'll go through the greens and browns in a minute. And there, what you do there is ideally you'll have more than one bay, and you fill one with an even mix of green and brown as you go along. And then at some point in time, ideally you're going to be keeping this covered as you go, especially here in Ireland, because you get a lot of rain. You don't want that heap getting saturated, because that will take out the air, number one, but it'll also cool down the heat, the heap a lot. And we want to keep the heat in there as much as possible. So you fill that for a period of time, keeping it covered down in between, either with a sheet of galvanized or a plastic cover or tarp or whatever you might be using, but just basically to not allow the rain to go into it. And again, at some point in time, you close off that heap. You'll begin your second heap beside it with the same mix of green and brown. And then at some point in time, you'll give that a turn. And that's typically, 4 months in, 3-4 months in is the ideal time to give it a turn. And then no matter what way you're doing it, you're going to need to leave that compost for kind of 12 months to get fully mature. Might look like compost after, depending on the time of year, but it could look like compost after 4 months. Winter time, it might take longer, it could take 6-7 months, but it's looks like compost and fully mature are slightly different. So that's what you're looking for, is that length of time. And again, you're looking for kind of 12 months there before you're fully mature. And therefore, kind of garden waste, vegetable peelings, leaves, things like that. And they're suitable for most gardens. I suppose one of the things that people are starting to really become conscious of is, their household food waste, particularly. And that includes your vegetable peelings, but it also includes things like, spoiled food, maybe bones from meats and so on. And all of that, people are becoming very, very conscious of that type of waste as well. And there is ways of getting rid of that. And so there's a couple of methods. So hot composting is hugely popular now. And it's something that I will definitely start doing, because again, I would be conscious of it as well. Don't have that much food waste. We're very good. I'm particularly good at not allowing there to be waste. I could eat something for several days until it's gone. But yeah, you would be conscious of it. And I think hot composting just gives you an extra ability to do, to compost things that you wouldn't normally be able to compost. And what hot composting is really, it's the same process, but because you're able to get temperatures much, much higher, because you're in an insulated unit of some sort. So they can be like an insulated box, for want of a better word. And they're typically, like a polystyrene type box. It's probably not made out of polystyrene, but that's the principle of it. It's a really tightly enclosed box that will get temperatures really hot. And that really hot temperature is what allows you to compost food waste. So it'll take out pathogens and things like that that potentially could be in it. Another version of hot composting is things like the big pig, as they call them. It's a cylinder, a metal cylinder with an insulated wall on it. So again, we'll have insulation within the wall, and then there's like a door, a hatch door on it, and you fill into that, and you tumble it and you roll it. The thing with hot composting is that you have to have a constant supply of material going in, or else the compost heap essentially switches off and turns off. So you have to keep feeding that all the time. And as we mentioned in that episode with Kate Flood, these are superb in terms of turning food waste, particularly into compost, but it can also be used for garden waste. And it will create a compost looking material much, much quicker. And it will take out all those pathogens. Again, a little bit like all of these, what you're saying is that it's still going to take, you create what looks like a compost in, 2 months, maybe, around a really short time frame, especially when the temperatures get high. But what comes out of that will look like compost, will be crumbly like compost, but it's not fully matured yet. And again, you still do need to give it that period of time. So when it comes out of that, actually, you might put it into, the derelict compost bin, or you might put it into a compost heap to allow it to just mature, to mature, because when it comes out, it'll be typically bacterial dominated. And as it matures further up to the 12 months, then it'll become more fungally dominated, and that's what you're looking for. So that's hot composting, and it's a really, in terms of food waste, it's a phenomenally good product. And one that that we spoke about quite a lot in that episode with Kate Flood was Bokashi bins. And Bokashi bins, the principle of them originates in Japan. And I got a sample of them, and I was using them actually earlier in the summer really, really well. So Ollie Green and Better Plants sells them. So essentially, it's a small little bin, like the compost caddies that you would see under your kitchen sink, for example. And on the bottom of it has a little mesh inside it, and that mesh allows liquid to go through. And essentially, what you do is you pack your vegetable peelings in, your food waste in there, and you squeeze it down with a tamper. So you're trying to get all the air out of it as much as possible. And then you shake on every time you put in a little layer, as in, a few centimeters, you shake on a little bit of bran as a starter. And this basically creates, it's like fermenting, for want of a better word, within the compost bin. And the reason you have two is that you keep layering that one to the top, and you fill it to the top, sprinkling it on as you go. And then it starts to release a juice, which can be used as a plant fertilizer. And as Kate Flood said, is very, very good for adding to drains and septic tanks, because it will activate and will remove the bacteria in it, will remove any coatings on your drains and so on. So it's a really good addition for that. But by mixing it and diluting it really, really well, it can be used as a plant food as well. And I used them quite successfully earlier in the year. And then I stopped doing it actually when I went on holidays, and just didn't reactivate it since. But they were working really well. So you have two bins, you fill one to the top, tamping it as you go, sprinkling it with bran as you go, and it produces this liquid that is very, very useful in the garden. At some point in time, then you leave that, when the second one gets full, you will dig a hole in your garden, and you will dig a hole, and then just pour the materials from the first bin into that, and cover it over with a good layer of garden soil. And if you rooted that out a couple of months later, all of the material will be gone. And because of the way it's being fermented, it creates a smell, but it's not a smell that's attracting to rodents. And that's something that people are really, really afraid of when they're composting, is that they'll attract rodents. But when it's fermented in this way, it does create a smell on the product, on the compost, but it's not a smell that is attractive to rodents. So you actually don't end up with problems from it. So you dig a hole, you bury that in the ground, and it's a Japanese type system, or originated in Japan, and it's a really, really good system, and one that I used for the first time this year, and yeah, found it really good. So definitely that's a really good one, and in a small situation, that's a very good way of dealing with household waste. You do need somewhere, obviously, to bury it, because you're gonna have this material. It's not compost when it comes out, so you have to have somewhere to bury it into the ground that then will become compost. But it's still a really, really good system. So they're kind of the ways of composting. Worm bins is another one. Not one I've used myself, but it's really, really brilliant. Worm bins, you buy the bin, it has the different layers in it. You get the worms to activate it at the start as well. And you're basically creating worm juice, and you're creating worm castings all the time. And these are hugely beneficial in the garden. As I say, I don't personally use it, but it's a great way of creating quality compost or worm cast. And I mentioned earlier on about the green and brown, and again, that's covered quite deeply in episode 210 with Kate Flood. So essentially, what you're looking for is you're looking for green or nitrogen rich material, and you're looking for brown, which is carbon rich material. And they're typically going to go in at a mix of 50-50. So in Ireland here, particularly in the summertime, we end up, particularly if we mow our lawns and collect the grass, we end up with quite a lot of green material and not so much of the brown material. And that's why it's useful to keep something like maturing wood chips or something like that close by, because that's a good balancer and will give you your brown material. Other brown materials include cardboard, brown cardboard, wood chip, some dry leaves. That's the type of brown material. You're also looking at in green. You're looking at grass, vegetable clippings, leaves of plants, deadheading of flowers or leaves, anything like that. Anything that's green and wet, for want of a better word, that typically falls under the green category, and dry and brown sort of fall under the brown carbon rich category. And you're looking for a sort of a 50-50 mix there then. Typically you're looking for that, but if you go slightly out of kilter, it's not too bad. But if you end up with a huge amount of green, the heap will become anaerobic and sludgy, and that's not what you want. So yeah, it's a simple process, and that episode 210 is really worth listening back to. So that's kind of your leaf molds and your composts. The question only related to leaf mold, but I do think that composting sort of ties in with that, because we're going to use these all for mulching beds, for improving the soil health, and that's hugely important. So it's good to tie them in. Coming up soon, I'm not sure when it'll be released yet, but the Christmas gifts for gardeners, this year's edition. Looking forward to that. Have a couple of guests lined up for that, and yeah, I'm sure it'll be quite similar to other years, but it's still going to be, yeah, it's interesting every year to hear that there's always a few new and different things on there. As I said, bare root season has really kicked off. So if you have any mind to do hedging, trees, shrubs, fruit garden, anything like that, now is the time. Get out and get it done when it's nice and dry. And yeah, as I say, it's all kicking off now. And that's been this week's episode. Thanks for listening, and until the next time, happy gardening.